Hello, I'm going to read some more from the Talmud of Jmmanuel, covering Saulus Paulus. Saul Paul, the apostolic letters, the letter to the Romans, and the letters to the churches, communities, in Corinth, Galatia, Philippi, Thessalonica, and to the Philemon. It is claimed by the Christian church that Paul, was descended from a strictly Jewish family and possessed Roman citizenship, was Hellenistically educated, and enjoyed a Pharisaic theological education. The Plieran annals, however, show different pictures, namely that Paulus was born as the son, Saulus or Saul, in a simple and poor craftsman's family. As an adult, he then entered the service as a soldier, where he, despite his unknowledgeableness in reading and writing, made it into a higher position. And at the age of 30 years, he followed a higher command, pursued Jmmanuel in Syria until shortly before Damascus, where he then, due to a giant fireworks display generated by Jmmanuel as festive fireworks, which were unknown to Saulus, got so mightily frightened that he changed his mentality and even became Paulus from Saulus. Paulus actually reached Rome in accordance with his conversion to a follower of Christ, that is, Jmmanuel, before Damascus, gathered believers around himself for Christianity. The first Romans and Greeks, from whom the first Christian group came into being. Thus he founded a small Christian community, which was not wanted by the Romans, however. Therefore, they were also persecuted, and that they were accused, on the one hand, of criminal deeds, and on the other hand, of blasphemy against the Roman gods. Some actually came to their sad end in the arena. But the majority of all deaths in the arena consisted of rebellious slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war. Indeed, only a few Christian believers lost their lives in their arenas. The apostolic letters are based on oral collations, some of which were dictated to scribes by Jmmanuel's like-minded companions, disciples, as they themselves were not knowledgeable of writings and letters dictated by disciples, were burned and completely destroyed by the early Christianity. That is, by the church that was becoming mightful. Tremendous falsification came about, not only from the oral traditions, but also from the recollections and the misunderstanding of the effective facts by the individual disciples and disciplesses. The apostolic letters do not lead back to Paul, not even in the littlest bit. Rather, these are individual works of various people who had nothing to do with Jmmanuel, and through whom, as a result of misunderstandings and erroneous traditions of the actual facts, further falsifications in the apostolic letters came about. The Pauline letters that are valid as the earliest writings, which came into being starting from 51a Jmmanuel, were not written by Paul because he was unknowledgeable of reading and writing, which depressed him very much, and his inferiority complexes clinging to him all his life, often strengthened until they became unbearable. The inferiority complexes of Paul also led to hatred against the female gender, towards which he was averse, and even hostile as an outspoken enemy and despiser of women. What immensely bothered him in his inferiority complex was the fact that he was not a real apostle, in the sense that he had never met with Emmanuel personally, and consequently also never learned from him. His sole encounter with Emmanuel was only an indirect one, when he pursued him and was frightened by his fireworks. See Talmud Emmanuel, chapter 33, Emmanuel in Damascus. Paul had his whole knowledge only from hearsay. The same also applies to Mark, the Gospel of Mark, because this one also never met Emmanuel. And so his knowledge was also only based on contacts with apostles and Emmanuel's followers, with whom he was in contact for some time. Paul was therefore not knowledgeable of, that is, not mighty in writing and reading, and thus he also could not write any Pauline letters. The whole thing is based on a swindle, which was fabricated by his followers. On the other hand, Paul only tried within a small framework to win the favor of the Roman authorities, which he feared as a result of his activities as a disciple of Christ, because the Roman captors were constantly in hot pursuit of him. The notion that Paul himself had tried very hard to win the favor of the Roman authorities corresponds to a conscious lie of his followers. The falsifications of the teaching of Emmanuel already took place through his disciples and discipluses. But Paul put the principal falsifications into the world, which happened, however, as it did with the other disciples and discipluses of Emmanuel, not out of maliciousness or for other lower reasons, but from a profound lack of understanding with respect to the teaching. And since, apart from Judas Iscariot, all disciples and discipluses were unknowledgeable of reading and writing, even monstrous falsifications came about from it. This happened in the wise that the disciples and discipluses who were unknowledgeable of reading and writing, to whom also Paul belonged, allowed their thoughts and their wrong understanding of Emmanuel's teaching to be written down by scribes who, of course, wrongly interpreted everything themselves and thus falsified everything further. The letter to the Romans, namely all 16 chapters, as well as the letters to the Christian communities in Corinth, Galatia, Philippi, Thessalonica, and to Philemon, as is recorded in the Pleiadian Annals, do not come from the hand of the apostle of the Gentiles, so not from that of Paul, because he was unknowledgeable of reading and writing. He was, however, the initiator of the letters, which he dictated to a literate Roman who was devoted to him in the belief in Christ, named Publius Curzio Grus, who, as was customary, wove in his own interpretations. The Qumran scrolls. The so-called Qumran scrolls, or Dead Sea Scrolls, do not correspond to the stolen first records of Judas Iscariot. The Qumran scrolls concern various records that were made shortly after Emmanuel's departure to India for a long time, and these were kept in a cave in Qumran. These erroneous original scrolls, which existed in 4 productions, served as fundamental teaching for the early Christians. Nothing is known, however, about the whereabouts of these 4 specimens, which differ from one another in content. At least one specimen is supposed to have reached Egypt. Emmanuel's work as a prophet. 1. Already at the age of 7 years, Emmanuel began to openly dedicate himself to his mission in his immediate surroundings, and he only attracted other circles around himself at the age of 10 years. Later, at the age of 14 years, he reached India through Gabriel, through his procreation father's help, in order to dedicate himself there to different teachings for several years, after which he returned at the age of around 18 and a half years old with a caravan to his homeland and continued his mission, about which no records were made, however. Such first came into being from Judas Iscariot during Emmanuel's greatest time of effect and until shortly thereafter. 2. The mention of all towns and villages, Talmud, page 82, does not refer only to Galilee and Perea, because Emmanuel went on his vast teaching travels all the way up to Syria. He was also active, however, in the areas of the Judeans, the Nabateans, and the Idumeans, also the areas of Samaria and Iturea, etc., were his area of instruction, as well as many others which he visited during his long years of teaching, which are not limited only to the few years that are mentioned by the New Testament. All these facts, however, were never written down and thus were also not handed down. It was only by the appearance of Judas Iscariot that the records began. On the same day, Talmud chapter 14 relates directly to the foregoing chapter. However, it is not mentioned here that the walk to the sea lasted 3 days with repeated interruptions. Number 3, the circumstances of the Galileans in relation to Judaism are not known to me. However, as to the disciples and discipluses of Emmanuel, these came mostly from Galilee and did not belong to the Jewish faith. All of them were so-called free believers, as the designation was at that time, according to the storage bank records. They considered themselves not as subjects of Herod, but as ones who were unbound. Emmanuel, with regard to the healing of the sick. Emmanuel's healer activity was based on the fact that he led the human beings through conversations and explanations to activating their self-healing powers, thoughts and feelings of certainty that they would be healed, created by their consciousness into healing themselves. The presentations of the healings correspond to the understanding at that time of the like-minded companions, disciples and discipluses of Emmanuel, and all other human beings who had no clue about these things whatsoever, and therefore interpreted everything according to their lack of understanding. Accordingly, it was also wrongly assumed that Emmanuel had healed by his spiritual power. These irrational teaching still exists today among religion-believing and sect-believing human beings who accept that spiritual healers and spiritual healeresses can heal human beings, animals, and plants by spiritual powers. Fundamentally, these are, in truth, the human consciousness powers of suggestion and self-suggestion capability, through which self-healing powers are activated in human beings, animals, and plants. And as a result, self-healings are generated. It must also be said that the healings in relation to lepers, paralytics, and the blind, etc., must not be taken so literally, as these are falsified and even fraudulently presented in the New Testament, because the healings did not concern these illnesses, but rather other sufferings, which were causing those who were sick problems. At the same time, these concerned, as a rule, thought and feeling-based, and thus also psychic and psychophysical damages, which could be partially or completely eliminated or healed by Emmanuel's help.